Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This episode of CTO Confessions is brought to you by the one and only IT Labs. And your host today is me, TC Gill, IT Labs Chief Talking Officer, and I'm speaking from London, UK. So, welcome to CTO Confessions, Todd. It's great to have you on board, sir.
Thank you, TC. Great to be here.
Brilliant. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What are you doing? Who do you work for?
So my name is Todd Ellermann. I'm the Senior Vice President of Product Engineering for ImagineLearning. We are a K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade distance learning provider or digital first content and technology provider. I've been there for 4.5 years. It's been a wild ride. I joined ImagineLearning in December of 2019, just before COVID. I wish I had the foresight to somehow anticipate EdTech going into COVID. I didn't. It was an incredible ride.
I'm curious, what brought you back to education? What is it about EdTech that you're really drawn to?
Well, I think at TripAdvisor, we had this wonderful mission of helping travelers, have a great travel experience. So that was a mission, but not maybe necessarily a world-altering mission. And I think the idea of engaging in educational technology for me really has been seeing the power of information and education as a real level setter worldwide. I think as education and the internet has become more available, it really is a way of breaking down barriers and exposing, opportunity through information to folks all over the world. And I think that's one of the messages that I broadly have is, today I lead a team of around 450 engineers spread all over the world, which is wonderful. And I think that message of we find incredibly talented, committed, engaged engineers worldwide. And really the only questions really come up is, I use this word recipe, which is the recipe of the squad or the team that's trying to achieve a goal, and the impact of time zone, occasionally, sometimes cultural communication kinds of challenges. And that certainly our target market is mostly the United States. And I think EdTech has been an incredible, interesting journey for me. At lynda.com, obviously, it was just snippets of education, trying to help people learn how to use a product or use a service. In K-12 education, we have some much loftier goals of actually trying to help a child learn a series of skills in a domain, math or English or social studies or whatever it might be. And as folks may or may not be aware, education in the US is state specific. And I think one of the things that K-12 education really unlocked for me, I found it very challenging as a domain and industry to kind of ramp up on, is the level of complexity. There's both business complexity as well as domain complexity that is maybe deeper than I think people realize. The good news is I think that leads to lots of startups entering the market. The bad news is I think it leads to lots of startups that fail in EdTech, repeat some of the same mistakes because they don't quite understand what they're getting into when they jump in. If I could, I'd like to share with folks a little bit about EdTech and kind of what I see. So in the US, each of the states might adopt their own standards. There were some standards that were kind of commonly adopted called Common Core, which I think represent maybe 20, 25 or so states that still kind of follow those standards. But most of the larger states, which also happen to be the larger markets, larger populations, have adopted their own standards. But those kinds of state standards, so in education, I would say all of our products do the same thing. So we exist in 3 or 4 different verticals: credit recovery, which is what I would call online summer school. This idea of helping students who failed a particular class get credit and get caught back up. Another one of our set of products is focused on supplementing a student, which is maybe an English language learner or somebody who's fallen behind or maybe needs extra practice, kinds of things. We call these supplemental products. And our goal in those products is just to get somebody caught back up as quickly as possible. And then also core, which is the newer industry that newer vertical that we moved into during the COVID time period, which is initial credit. This idea that we replace traditional textbooks with a combination of a workbook and digital content and interactions that teach initial concepts. So those three verticals, and then ImagineLearning has an amazing group of teachers. We have 1,100 teachers who actually use our content to support districts when maybe they're having trouble finding a particular certified teacher in that state. Or sometimes, like maybe an AP biology class, it's a small district. There's only 4 or 5 students who are interested, but this district still wants to offer that capability. Some of our educators, our teachers will actually teach those kids, which is great. So we're in these different business verticals, but all of our products fundamentally do the same things. We roster or load up the kids, get login and password going, get them assigned to a class and a teacher. We assign them content. Sometimes that content might be an assessment, the idea that we might actually assess where they are in relationship to where they need to get to over the course of a semester or a school year. And then we line up content for them to interact with. They do that content, consume that content, interact with that content. We obviously want to track all of that activity in the form of data. So we're watching that student learning events. We're tracking kind of each of their steps along the way. And then we want to reflect that data back to our educators. And the educators then oftentimes either maybe grade that content or they're assigning additional content. Oh, it seems like you maybe need to reinforce this concept or that concept kind of thing. Of course, all that activity is happening inside the context of a subject, a state, with maybe state specific standards. And when we get to the administrator, they want to see that the teachers and the students are engaged in the learning activity using the tools that they're paying for and showing growth. We want to see the data that show those students actually learning to incorporate those skills and reflect them back through assessment. Sometimes it's through a mastery check or sometimes through a summative exam or assessment kind of thing, depending on the level. And then, of course, the actual buyers of our product might be at the district level or at the state level, and they want to see growth is happening across a broad swath of students. I joke about one of the challenges that was posed to me, even in my initial interview, is how do we demonstrate that we are being efficient with the capital that we're deploying in building these products and features and content and capabilities? In the consumer, direct to consumer space at TripAdvisor, we A/B tested every feature we added. We rolled it out. I even talk sometimes about we did 404 tests. So HTTP 404 is a not found response. Sometimes we would put a button up and count how many 404s we got to see if that button was something that customers might actually be interested in. Now, of course, we only showed it to a small percentage. With the volume of traffic that TripAdvisor had, we could really understand quite quickly whether or not consumers were interested in an idea that we were exploring. Very direct connection between here is the feature we're adding, here's the code it was going to take, the estimation, delivery of it. We would do very MVP oriented, and then we would measure that and be able to show increased engagement, increased sales, those kinds of things. So the idea of measuring the efficiency of our capital investment was quite an easy loop to wrap your head around and measure. And working at TripAdvisor under Steve Koffer is a great CEO to work for, very data oriented and a culture of experimentation and being data driven, which was, which I love and try and advocate for. But then you come to the EdTech arena, and our business, I would say, is something like B to G to D to S to P to S to T to S. And it's, if I broke all that down, we sell business to government, we sell to states, and we sell to districts who might have superintendents who are making some of their decision making. But then they actually turn and give the products to the principal in the schools and the teachers, and eventually it's actually the students consuming our content that is actually the educational activity that's happening. And we firmly believe in partnering with educators. Everything we know is that we want to make educators' job easier and be a tool or a support tool for them. They really, are critical to the recipe of successful education. But with that kind of long chain of who our buyer is versus who our actual end users are, being those teachers and students, it's quite challenging to connect the dot between this capital investment for this feature or this capability actually yields this return on investment as a business. And ultimately, I believe that business is a very efficient way of deploying capital in order to generate outcomes. I've seen some of that in some of the nonprofits that have dabbled in the ed tech space. There's a real difference for the efficiency and the effectiveness, I think, of actual businesses for profit. I think that is a challenge in the ed tech market, and some folks believe we should do it for free. And, we see some people in the market who make attempts at that. The other thing that's really interesting is when we want to show that growth occurring for those students, we're doing assessment, which adds a level of complexity, item pools, and statistical analysis. Are those items actually measuring the skill that we want to do? But then we also have to align that to state standards to be able to show that growth to our actual customer and the government. So I think this complexity in ed tech is, I think, quite interesting. And at the end of the day, our real goal is to cause educational, activity, to cause growth, right? To help children develop those skills. And there's also this real challenge in a social media, video game playing world is how do we walk the line of edutainment?
That's right. Yes. Keep that engagement.
Yeah, well, how do we, mentally we want these, they're used to TikToks and all kinds of things, and yet we need them to be willing to engage with content. And sometimes we talk a little bit about social and emotional learning and development, and there's this idea of grit, right? Is the child actually buckling down and solving or being willing to try the harder problems? And that's not necessarily the way a lot of the other online content they're receiving is much more interested in either just entertaining them and or being fun, not necessarily causing them to challenge them to think and to maybe even guess what they're thinking about.
That's right. You mentioned an interesting thing offline around making it sticky. You can get the stickiness right, but the actual growth of the education is maybe not so great. And that's an interesting one. I'm just curious, is there a science behind this? Are there people doing research on how you create that right balance, especially with the newer generation of people?
There are certainly lots of different research things that I have been exposed to. I haven't seen anybody totally crack the nut of we see people like Nir Eyal and talks about, making a product stick. And there are certainly lots of research about how to get people engaged in products. But walking that fine line between being engaging and causing actual skills or actual educational activity to happen, the real challenge. In fact, ImagineLearning, the original ImagineLearning product was a product called Language and Literacy. And that product, we actually used the Unity gaming engine to provide kind of more interactive educational kinds of activities. And that product has driven a premium in the market for years because it's been both efficacious and really engaging for young students and English language learners, which is kind of where it originally got started. But it is challenging and costly to develop content, and developing content, particularly that's more edutaining, is challenging. Which leads us, everybody in the market is facing this generative AI conversation, and
Yeah, that's right. I was going to just bring that in. Yeah.
so generative AI is certainly something we're spending a great deal of time looking at in the world of content creation. How can we be more effective and more efficient at refreshing or making great edutainment type content? And generative AI has certainly unlocked new ideas and new efficiencies in that arena. Certainly, we are trying to find that boundary between where generative AI is helpful and where our expertise. We have people who are dedicated instructional designers with years of experience who understand the details around the state standards and what's expected of educational content. And it is fascinating to see their work streams get optimized, and yet still they generate tremendous value at the end of that work stream. There are certainly limitations to what generative AI can do. And that's, I think everybody in EdTech is looking at that. And then, of course, the academic integrity conversation. For years, people have argued about whether or not a kid can play a video faster or whether they need to sit. In some states, they actually have laws that say the kid has to sit for a certain amount of time in front of the screen. They don't want to allow them to play that video faster. Is that stopping education or causing education to happen? But as you can imagine, as students and people are developing tools to hook generative AI into responding to questions and quizzes, we're well past just being able to detect plagiarism where somebody's taken somebody else's work product and submit it. But now, they're using generative AI to generate that content. And do they actually have mastery of the concepts or the skills that are being asked for by the teachers?
Wow. So, from a tech leadership perspective, it just sounds like a really complex area. You kind of mentioned all these different, this chain of people, these chain of customers, different needs. From a tech leadership perspective, how do you handle that complexity? It's not just about creating the products, it's around making sure that you're ticking boxes in all these kind of different areas.
Yeah, there's also lots of state standards for integration for different systems we integrate with, as well as certainly our customers deserve and are asking for accessibility compliance and other things, which adds to a lot of complexity. Our solution, and we're very fortunate to be a collection of acquisitions that have kind of grown individually over time, but also coming together. And so we've developed a series of platform components, if you will. As I mentioned, rostering or loading up kids for login and password. As you can imagine, that's a very similar activity. And we're doing that with the same customers over and over for different products. So we've developed some what we call toolkits, or really what I would say encapsulated components or services. And taking a service oriented architecture and an event driven architecture is one of the things that we've done by having a Lambda Kinesis event stream. And we've standardized across all of our products the taxonomy of those events. We're leveraging an industry standard called Caliper. Now, we've had to bend and twist it because it doesn't fully meet our needs, but we kind of based our initial events off of that. And that's allowed us to have various tech stacks for our actual application experiences and yet have a standard educational set of events flowing into our warehouse. And we're on the cusp of being able to actually show a student's educational journey across a variety of products and the different domains we talked about, or the different vertical solution spaces. And we're pretty excited that we're uniquely positioned to really talk about a student's educational journey and growth, and how our supplemental products have accelerated that growth or gotten a child back on track. And we think that educational story is certainly a compelling one in the market. As a technology leader, it does mean that I have teams. We have Ruby on Rails, Groovy on Grails, Python, Django, we got .NET. Our newest rewrite of one of our flagship products is leveraging React. And then our services are being written in Kotlin on Micronaut and GraalVM. I had an interesting hypothesis that we could shrink our startup time of our containers if we compiled down to Docker native services with GraalVM and Micronaut. And that's been a really interesting and very successful approach to kind of building our next generation services. And this event-driven architecture, and it kind of one of the things I wanted to explore a little bit. We are in this I'm constantly being challenged by our board and by our leadership to be efficient with capital. And, my response has been to advocate for DORA metrics. Hey, great engineering organizations measure these things. This is what shows we're being a good organization. And I've certainly bought a lot of trust with the business by maintaining stability. And then when we have incidents, being very quick to respond to restore customer experience, and other focuses on security and other things, which, as you can imagine, are critical to all of us in our thinking these days. But it's been tough to figure out how to argue for efficiency. And I got to believe that most of your listeners out there are, in some form or another, being pressed by their business leaders to demonstrate, are you being efficient with my capital? These software engineers are incredibly expensive. We represent a huge portion of the capital investment that's being made in SaaS technology businesses. Todd, are you and your team, are you being efficient with this capital that I'm giving you? And leveraging nearshore and farshore engineers, in my assertion that there are great engineers worldwide, runs into challenges. And the question we've been trying to answer is one, how could we measure that? We have not been successful at finding a way in this industry. The best that I've read in the research says that an engineer can estimate work in a domain that they know with a tech stack they know. A senior engineer is about 70% accurate, which tells me there's a pretty large variability out there that of surprises. And I think great engineers early on in projects that we call it driving a spike or a proof of concept, will try and drive out that uncertainty. But it takes 20% of the work to drive out that uncertainty to kind of get to accurate estimation. Well, in the world of business relationship, hey, we're handing you this capital, go build this feature, but you're telling me you're only 70% accurate around when you're going to deliver it. That's kind of a tough argument that we are committed, that we are technologically capable, and we're doing good quality work. How do we show that in the industry? There have been some interesting products that we've taken a look at, Jellyfish and Haystack and Linear B. Everybody seems to be trying to do the same thing, which is to create some dashboards around Dora metrics and then try and make some claim that if you merge some code and somebody else overwrites that code within 30 days, somehow you have wasted your time. And I don't, like that's somehow inefficient, that code got merged over or enhanced or improved. I don't buy that. I think we understand problems in iterative form, especially if you're working in an agile fashion. And so it feels like a number of these tools are kind of not being really honest about what they're actually measuring. And they'll claim, hey, we'll show you efficiency. But I regularly see examples where their efficiency doesn't actually fit with the engineers who are truly moving the ball forward or truly driving success. So
I guess the danger here is that if you kind of use these tools, it'll drive behavior, which is actually unhelpful and actually kind of creates the problem that probably wasn't there before.
Yeah, the Measure What Matters is one of those books that I love. And certainly, as an industry, we proved a long time ago that measuring lines of code of productivity is not a measure that is actually reasonable. But at the same time, in the TripAdvisor world, we could show that build these features, this team that cost this amount of money, built this capability, generated this increased return on investment. Over here, I understand the business need to have a relationship between capital investment and return on investment. And for all the challenges of that business to all the things model, and the challenge with connecting, certainly we're doing things like statistical analysis on whether an item accurately measures a skill being achieved, or a piece of content, is it being effective or efficient at actually generating students getting higher scores. But adding features to a student experience, how did that feature actually yield commercial return when our sales cycle is about relationships? It's about RFP responses with all the, we're checking all the features, but which of those features actually yielded result?
Yeah. So you've described quite a lot of challenges. And what is the thing that really plays on your mind as a tech leader in this space? What's the biggest of those challenges?
With this capital efficiency conversation out there, using engineers from lower cost markets is certainly something that the business is pushing on us to do. And finding that balance between engineering governance and oversight. And this idea, I have this idea, I'm not sure I'm unique in this idea, but that the distance from San Francisco in, let's say, 100-mile increments puts you a month further behind kind of what is cutting edge technology today. Some sort of inverse relationship to San Francisco is a function of where you're at. Now, I happen to be in Phoenix, Arizona. I was president of the Phoenix Java user group for a number of years. And one of the things that I saw is that my relationships with some engineers who I had either gone to school with or other things in the Bay Area were introducing new ideas to me that were not common in my market. So here I am, just maybe 400 or 500 miles from San Francisco, and already we're 3 months, 6 months, a year behind architecturally what folks were talking about in the Bay Area. And I think as a distributed company, we've seen this as we've engaged different vendors and engineers kind of around the world, that we've had to bring ideas to them because they have not been exposed to what have already kind of become standard practices for our FTEs here in the States. Recently, I had the opportunity to visit my 42nd country, so I feel very privileged to kind of
Yes, yes.
travel around the world. And I got a chance to visit some of our teams in India here just a few weeks ago. And I was surprised to learn when I was sitting down to lunch with one of our vendors that even though we as a team had done an A/B test on and looked at how much efficiency we would gain from Copilot, GitHub Copilot being incorporated in our IDE, we'd seen that especially for junior developers, there's some real value in efficiency gains. And we had paid for a license for all of our engineers who were in our Okta and working on our products, that a whole team of 40 or so engineers had not embraced or even started utilizing it and
Wow.
didn't really see what the value was. I can't imagine anybody in San Francisco that hasn't been using GitHub Copilot for at least a year, if not, a year and a half or longer. Our team did a demo of it even a couple years ago. And here's a team that's working for us, doing good quality work. They deliver some great features. They're effective and efficient. They deliver on time. And yet, when we sit down with them, we realize that this idea has not crossed the pond and not made it into their world as a part of their practices yet. So
It's quite surprising.
I think that's quite common. We have seen that at time and again. So again, we did this event-driven architectures, and a number of times we know in event-driven architectures, if you're generating events that downstream consumers need to consume, that you need to move the event generation and get your POC of event generation earlier in the project. So the folks that are downstream kind of consuming, needing to take action on those events, get those sample events early on in their process. So you don't
Right.
stock that cycle. This idea became a real challenge a couple years ago in our MyPath product, because we had an offshore vendor that was in a critical role for our educator experience of that product. And they were struggling. We were asking, hey, we need you to get these events flowing. And they kept pushing that work down their priority list until it became an actual critical path problem. And then the issue, then we finally crossed the chasm. They started to understand the concepts, and then it flowed through. But I think we've seen that. And again, talented engineers just not having been exposed, haven't worked in an AWS event-driven architecture world before. And I think that is the challenge of engineering leadership these days, is more and more, I think you're going to have teams that are, whether you're supporting remote work, or, a couple days a week or all the time, is this challenge of how do I make sure that architectural and technical concepts and practices are getting disseminated out to your teams, especially at scale.
So the question I have is that what is it about San Francisco? Why is it such a kind of hotbed for stuff? Why can't that be elsewhere? Why
Uh,
can't there be other epicenters?
there might be other small epicenters of technological innovation in particular areas. I just certainly think the Northwest has led us, or at least as long as I've been in the game here, has been the universe. Whether it's the combination of companies that are there or the density of technical talent that's there.
That's right.
Although certainly COVID and remote has unlocked some of those folks being all over the country and less centered in one physical location. Years at TripAdvisor, there was a relationship to technical talent availability, and there was some belief amongst TripAdvisor engineering leaders that TripAdvisor would not have survived in the Bay Area competing for talent to be a critical engineering organization in the Boston area. They were able to grab some great talent out of some great schools there during the dot-com era that led to, the technological advancement. Obviously, I was leading their Los Angeles area team, and LA is, it's not to say that LA is not also a hotbed of technology, and Boston area is not a hotbed of technology. I think, New York City, there are certainly kind of centers of density of technology, but there certainly seems to be some inverse relationship between how far people are behind what the latest is happening. Certainly there are individuals who are early adopters who cross those bridges or who push those envelopes worldwide, but again, there's nothing unique other than just the density of IT happening.
It reminds me of the book No Rules Rules, the Netflix story where they talk about tech talent density and the impact that it has on the organization. They were very designed and intentional about making sure that they upped their tech talent in their space. It had all these kind of repercussions and kind of emergent results and outcomes. But yeah, it's kind of interesting how you describe around other companies, because certain industries have more what I would call attraction. I've spoken to many tech leaders, and some of the industries that they find it very difficult to get techies to want to come into their space because it's not as, if I may use the word, sexy. And I guess that's another level of challenge that you have as tech leaders, is how do you make your what you're working on, which is interesting, more interesting to people making assumptions about it.
Yeah, I think we feel very fortunate because we have this incredible mission to actually empowering potential, which is, the kind of the words we wrap around this idea of really trying to unlock or help education happen. And I think I feel incredibly fortunate. I have a very talented team around me, and a portion of their loving what we're doing is their connection to that mission or that vision. I do think, and I have worked in other industries, web hosting is one where it was challenging to make that interesting because it was a commodity poured out on servers kind of thing.
That's right. It reminds, again, just to bring another book in, which I read a long time ago. Have you ever read the book Fish?
No.
It's about a fish market, which is cold, smelly, and absolutely not the kind of place you want to hang out. But these fish marketeers have basically made their job so interesting and enthralling. It actually attracted customers and actually made the work environment really, really interesting. And what it was as a project manager was fascinating how they were making their work so interesting and took some of the lessons back to working in the tech field. So I don't know, maybe that's an interesting one for some of our tech leader audience out there to get creative about how you make the work interesting and get people's energies up.
Yeah, I think we in the industry, I certainly have done that, like our Kotlin Micronaut Graal VM experiment. And we have something called our Ops Toolkit, which is we're doing a second generation of that, kind of leveraging some different and newer technologies. I think that most engineering leaders attempt to allow people to push the envelope a little bit. Of course, there are some folks who stumbled by pushing too far, maybe into enterprise Java beans or back in the day where, misuse of technology and not quickly evaluating whether that newer technology was being successfully deployed. There's been some interesting challenges that we have because some of our acquisitions are of tech stacks that are fading in the industry. And how do you attract talent to come work on that Ruby on Rails app that is, gathering dust, if you will, which is quite challenging.
I feel the pain. I really feel it. So, Todd, as we come to the closing arc of our time together, I've got some really nice, warm questions for you. The first one is what advice would you give to any aspiring tech leaders out there listening to this who are on their journey to positions like your kind self? What advice would you impart to kind of maybe make that journey easier or even faster?
Yeah, I think, and I teach this to my leaders quite a bit, and I want to reiterate this time and again: be faster to move and deal with performance problems, whether it's FTEs or contractors. There's nothing worse when I hear a manager saying, "Well, we're getting what we pay for," or something like that. I think it's the humans, whether it's FTEs or contractors, it's the humans, and protecting the integrity of the team and addressing performance concerns in a timely fashion is the most important thing you can do as a technology leader. And the other coupled thing that I believe in, with kind of hand in hand with that, is being very actively engaged in the hiring practices and process that your team is using. I know it's very unpopular in the broader marketplace, but I am a firm believer in having engineering coding practices during the interview process. I have been a believer in that for 20 years now. We've been very effective at predicting whether someone's going to be successful or not as a part of them answering technical questions and doing coding during the interview process,
Wow.
including my management and people leaders. I believe, and my directors and managers can read and write code. And I think that's one of the reasons people love working here is
Mm,
their leader can actually give them constructive feedback on their code and appreciate when they do clever architectural technology things.
yes, that's right.
Actually can read it. So I just, that message, I can't iterate strongly enough, and that manage people who are not performing out in a timely fashion, and be actively engaged in your hiring practices, who you hire, even contractors, who you make your team up, how you assemble your team, and who and what expectations and their opportunity to see your level of engagement as a leader shows up in participating in the interviewing and hiring practices.
Excellent, excellent. And any books or any other assets that you would like to kind of share that have been really instrumental in your journey that
Yeah.
would help our tech leader audience?
So for sure, I hand it out to many people. I'm still surprised 10 years later when people haven't read the Phoenix Project. I just the concepts of the theory of constraints and the idea of DevOps concepts that are just conveyed in that wonderful story, although painful for many of us, traumatic because it hits close to home. Uh,
Yeah.
and I don't know that reading the book Accelerate is all that is kind of a follow-on book, but the Dora metrics and that work that's come out of Accelerate just goes hand in hand with what I think just should be fundamental in engineering leadership today. So I'm constantly surprised when I'm handing this book out and people haven't been exposed to the Phoenix Project. Uh,
Mm,
I think Docker and DevOps and immutable infrastructure was such a revolutionary change. Now I got to reconsider the impact of AI, because that feels like the next super shift is occurring now, actively occurring, and getting my handle around how we should be applying that is something we're actively wrestling with as an engineering organization. I don't know that I found the book that unlocks that key yet. Certainly, people are publishing lots of ideas, but our world is certainly changing in an interesting way.
yeah, I think on that note, because I've been really curious as to being a software engineer and electronics engineer in the past, I've been really curious as to how that is impacting engineers. And there's lots of people with YouTube channels about sharing their kind of use cases of it. And I was really surprised by some of them. One interesting one, which is I'm a really big fan of, is refactoring code and getting the AI to kind of do that for you, refactor certain things. So the other one was adding comments to your code to give an explanation as to what it's doing. And I thought, wow, personally, I have to do that as I go along. But hey.
I think one of the ideas that I was speaking with some of our partners with recently was we have a product that's written on an older tech stack, and the product is fantastic. The tech stack has been somewhat challenging to find talent to work on it. And one of
Mm,
the translation is one of the things that generative AI does interestingly well.
wow.
One of the challenges I'd outlined for some of our vendors is, what would it take to feed this code base into generative AI and translate it into one of our, what I would call invest tech stacks, which might be a translation in architecture. In some case, it's a monolith, and we want to actually go to more of a service-oriented architecture. So there's real work to figure out how to decompose that into directory
Mm,
structures and files, and how could you, autogen and some other things that are, for
yeah.
kind of doing batch work to translate it, but but then trying to, actually fire it up, run it through regression. Obviously the health of that initial code base ends up determining the health of the target code base.
Yes.
But could we actually take that and translate it to a newer tech stack?
Yes.
That that feels like right up the Gen AI alley.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something that's just reminded me actually, just kind of go slightly to one side. I remember working when I was in the embedded field, we used a tool called Rhapsody. I think it was done by IBM. And that was lots of kind of like block diagrams, sequence diagrams, and then you generated code from that. So it's a very kind of you wrote stuff in English and described what you wanted to do, and then it would generate the code for you. And I guess maybe that's where it'll kind of go back to, maybe, because I know there was an attempt to do that. And we made a real success of it when we did it. I thought it was excellent.
I think we 20 years ago, I would have told you I thought UML by now we'd be drawing boxes and building
Yes.
applications that way. And obviously that hasn't come to fruition. I think the next generation was kind of the REPL, the Ruby on Rails, the frameworks for kind of generating, hey, I write the model and you'll generate controllers and views and stuff for me. But I think what we found there is we could do that initial generation, and that's great in a startup. But as soon as you started to scale up, you ended up writing code in the actual application, and the ability to keep generating kind of fell apart. I
Mm,
think the one of the ideas that one of my fellow engineering leaders and I have been talking quite a bit about, if you think about Cucumber as a test language, behavioral driven test language, and maybe Gherkin as the DSL on top of that test language, and you think about product managers writing epics and stories, the acceptance criteria, there's still a bit of a gap between those two worlds, but they're getting closer and closer, and they're both text. And so I haven't talked to the Atlassian folks. I'm anxious to talk to them. It seems like they naturally should be in the place of leveraging generative AI to give product managers like critical feedback on epics and stories,
yes.
estimation. This whole generative AI should be able to look across a body of previous epics and previous stories and how long they took to complete, and be
Yes.
to provide an estimation perspective. It's still not the same as an engineer who's going to say, oh, you said this word, which means this technology, which means this problem.
Mm,
There's no substitute for that. But generative AI is certainly going to be in our arena for helping the quality of epics and stories and estimation. T-shirt sizing is something that it can probably do a reasonable job if you've got an
yes.
existing team functioning at a consistent velocity. Feel like those tools are coming, but how is our one of the projections we're making is that our job might change in the way, if I can craft a prompt with a bunch of architectural context, and I can give it domain context, and I can start to build up that body of contexts as inputs, it can generate the code, it can generate the tests, it can run the tests, it can merge the code, it can, like, each of these steps down the line are doable. And as long as I don't get in and start modifying the end code, if we think about code as more like binary, right? And we stop thinking about it as the stuff we write, it feels like our engineers are going to get closer and closer to actually specifying what the system is supposed to do. And I think today engineers collaborate heavily with product folks, and I don't see jobs going away. What I see is jobs evolving, where
Yeah.
engineers are more involved in the specification and letting the generative AI generate the downstream stuff, and being less concerned about the quality of that intermediary code, because I can run it
Yes.
through SonarQube, and I can run it through check marks and validate
Mm,
security and validate, code quality, code smells, and I can have a different bot actually improve the quality of the code, as a part of that process. There's still understanding that engineers need to have, but it feels like product management might be pushed more to evolve towards listening to customers and engaging in that UX research side of things uh,
yeah.
over time. Now, is that 5 years or is it another 10 years? I don't know. But it seems like a series of problems I can now see the solution to
Yeah.
that can be improved upon. It no longer feels like it's, oh, I'm going to say something to a computer and it's just going to fancifully write something. Like, that actually is now happening, right? It may
Mm,
not be writing very accurate code, it may not be writing scalable code, but it can, and it can get better, and we can give it more context and more. eh, Another idea we've been playing around with is, clean code, Uncle Bob. Can we get a repository of an application in a particular coding language that's all demonstrating good quality? I don't care what the product does, I don't care what the application does, but it demonstrates good architecture and good code quality, right? All the
yes.
Well, once I have that, can I vectorize that and feed that into my LLM that's a part of my coding assistant So when it recommends code, it's recommending from a body
Mm.
of relatively good, clean code to begin with, instead of just a body of code, right? Today, I'm terrified to have some of our repositories be indexed by an LLM, because the
Yes.
last thing I want is the world generating more of the crap code that, you know, got
Really?
written in a
Yes.
startup, 20, 15 years ago,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was brilliant code then, but 15 years later, we've moved on from that tech stack, that architecture,
Yes. I think
you know,
you're right. I think AI is more of an assistant.
we're going to be challenged as CTO leaders to actually write down our context,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the only way we're going to get the prompt to reflect back our expectations, is we're going to actually have to do work to convey our architectural ideas, our lessons learned.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah. It is going to be fascinating. So I'm kind of mindful of time. So I just want to ask you a fun question now, which I know we spoke about very briefly before when we were offline. I'm going to pretend to be the tech genie for a second. I'm going to offer you a wish for your industry, for your leadership, for your people. What would you wish for?
My initial response to this one has got to be, I wish the browsers would continue to advance their technology. I think HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are an abysmal place to have settled as an industry on
Yeah.
how we build applications. JavaScript's a horrible language, and I wish somebody would wake up inside one of those browser worlds and declare, no, we're actually going to move forward to some better tools and better languages for expressing, building web app, accessible, responsive web applications. I'm not sure the word web there should mean what it means today.
Yeah.
I'm kind of dumbfounded we haven't advanced.
Yeah.
Email is another one that I just can't believe we haven't advanced from a protocol and a technology and a capability. And then of course the one I'm going to run for president on this one, which is accountability on phone calls. Telephone has almost been made useless by spam calls, and it's just, I can't believe we haven't advanced the fundamental technology so that we can hold people accountable for unsolicited
Yes.
marketing
Yes.
calls.
I think that's an interesting point, actually, as the tech genie, speaking from the tech genie's perspective, that it kind of worked and it was good enough and it's kind of just settled for where it is. But so I'm gonna inject some mojo into that space and get that technology moving. So anybody listening out there wants to be part of that party, get on with it, because we need to kind of move on and evolve. So that's excellent. So as we come to the final full stop of the podcast, unfortunately, Todd, what's your final key takeaway that you'd like to offer the tech leader audience or the techies out there as a parting gift?
Just there are brilliant engineers worldwide. I appreciate all the ones that I get an opportunity to interact with, and I just take care of your people, and I wish you all well wherever you are in the world. Look forward to learning from you all.
Brilliant. Love it. Very human centric and heartfelt message there to finish on. Thank you very much, Todd. It's been great having you on CTO Confessions.
Thank you, TC. It's been a real pleasure.
And finally, remember to subscribe to CTO Confessions podcast and IT Labs newsletter, where you get regular tech articles and invites to the IT Labs webinar series. URLs for this can be found at the bottom of this page. We are consistently creating material to create, nurture and support a community of tech leaders. And of course, if you want to know more about IT Labs services, including our Teams as a Service service, please don't hesitate to get in touch. As mentioned in the intro, please think of us like tech leaders' favourite off-the-shelf service, providing agility, high-performing teams off that shelf with a wide breadth of skill and knowledge. Well, that's all, folks. Look after each other and keep safe. Wishing you all a good day or evening wherever you are in the world from all of us here at IT Labs. Live long, live well and prosper. Until we meet again on the next CTO Confessions podcast.